Our next speaker is Davy Crockett, who comes from Saratoga Springs, Utah. He's a veteran ultra-runner historian and author. He has run or hiked more than 1,000 miles in the Inner Canyon. He is the author of 10 books on American history and the history of the sport of ultra-running, including his new book, Grand Canyon, Rim to Rim History. He is currently the director of the American Ultrarunning Hall of Fame and produces the Ultrarunning History Podcast. I was also recently made aware of his website, which is fantastic, and it's my pleasure to introduce Davy Crockett.
Yes, my name's really Davy Crockett, and I have a coonskin hat. I didn't kill a bear when I was 3, though. So, my new book is a multi-year effort going through thousands of newspaper articles, collecting stories in people's own words about their experiences traveling across the canyon. And my motivation for writing it was to help hikers and runners going rim to rim to have a greater respect for the canyon. I really want them to stop treating the trails as a Disneyland ride. And thankfully, the book is doing very, very well in reaching that audience. And for this talk, I pulled out of the book some stories about 2 individuals that made a difference in the lives of youth who hiked into the Inner Canyon. Now, you may have not heard of them before, Thomas Cureton and Charlie Thornton. Guides have made a significant contribution over the decades for those who experienced the Inner Canyon. Even before the establishment of the park, early guides were indispensable to prospectors, hunters, and tourists that dared to descend into the primitive trails to travel rim to rim. Early guides were a combination of mule skinners, tourist guides, and entertainers. And at the Bright Angel Lodge, in 1902, after tourists spent a long day on the trail, John Hanson and William Bass would tell their tales to an evening crowd to guests in the reception room. And one guest said of Hans, quote, "He is a teller of marvelous stories of impossible occurrences, which he narrates with such realistic effect as to create the impression that he thoroughly believes them." Shorty Yarbury, he's buried in the cemetery, a Texas cowhand, arrived in the canyon in 1919 and became a famous character. He worked for decades as a guide for the Fred Harvey Company, and he was a talented dancer and would trick the women visiting Phantom Ranch to teach him how to dance. One skeptical Phantom Ranch visitor wrote, "After supper, we all sat around loafing and listening to the cowboys. I don't think they were real." Guide Dean Clevenger, a rancher from Oklahoma who was a guide for more than a decade, was another colorful character. When people in his mule train would ask why the Kolb Studio snapped photos of them as they began their Inner Canyon trek, he would explain that the photos were needed to, quote, "identify the bodies." After a woman hiked down to Phantom Ranch and didn't want to hike back up again, he had fun with what he called a drag out. He told her that she could go back up by mule, and then added, "Of course, we got nothing left but blind mules, but them mules hear real good." Some of the greatest guide contributions to the canyon were accomplished by people who were not employed by the canyon. And one of them is Thomas Cureton of Williams, Arizona, who was a significant Grand Canyon rim-to-rim contributor. Through his selfless service in the 1920s, he passed on the love for the Inner Canyon to a generation of youth who lived on the doorstep of the canyon. He was originally from Missouri and moved to Williams in 1906 and became the superintendent of schools. He was given the nickname of Professor, shortened to Prof. Teaching conditions were challenging in the small city with about 1,000 residents, and the schools, grades 1 through 8, were crowded with about 200 children, 50 per room, where Cureton was both principal and teacher of multiple grades. Cureton was not timid about doing unusual things to spark the interest of his students. As the snow started to fall, he constructed a toboggan slide 80 feet long in the schoolyard for the 8th and 9th grade boys. And then the girls wanted their chance too, and he made that possible. Early in 1912, as the school children were still on winter break, the Williams School burned down from a chimney fire. Thanks to his lobbying efforts, within a month of it burning, a larger school was planned to be built. The new larger school was completed in only 8 months, ready for the next school year. Cureton was also a brilliant attorney, businessman, and state congressman. During the 1920s, he went into the tourist business and invented the idea of the garage cabin. He built 28 such units with private garages in Williams at his auto camp. And during one season, he hosted 6,000 cars and 29,000 tourists heading to and from the Grand Canyon and other destinations. In 1925, Cureton, age 48, started bringing youth groups to the canyon to experience a double crossing and camping in rugged open-air conditions, no tents. His first group that started down Bright Angel Trail in June 1925 included 7 young women, ages 16 through 20, 3 ladies, and 3 men. They planned for a 10-day double crossing on foot. Each member carried a knapsack with only 1 blanket, a tin plate, a spoon, a canteen, personal items, and enough food for 10 days, and they camped in the open. They made it down to Havasupai Gardens on the first day, and Cureton wrote, "After supper, we spread our blankets in the sand and gravel for our first night. The girls sang us to sleep." The next day, they hiked on the Tonto Trail and then down the nearly complete South Kaibab Trail and crossed over the scary swinging suspension bridge that was constructed in 1921. They camped for the second night above Phantom Ranch and then took a plunge in Bright Angel Creek. The next section of the hike was the toughest. Hiking up Bright Angel Canyon, they had to wade the creek 37 times in 2 miles, and the water was cold and swift in places, 2 feet deep with round, rolling, slick boulders. And then 2 days later, they reached the north rim by going up the old Bright Angel Trail that went straight up, and Theodore Roosevelt went through that way 2 decades further. The new North Kaibab Trail up Roaring Spring was under construction, but they couldn't go on that yet. So on the north rim, some cowboys at Wooley's cabin loaned the group some tents, but it was so cold that by 3 a.m., most of them were huddled around a large campfire, wrapped in their blankets, trying to keep warm. They improved their sleeping conditions and spent 3 nights camping on the north rim. They said campfire songs, the campfire songs and stories were a scream. Among the activities, they had a successful snipe hunt. I didn't know they existed that long ago. The journey back went well, and they successfully reached the south rim, where the cars were waiting for them. 2 months later, in August 1925, Cureton led another group comprising of 11 boys. Their activities differed from the girls. They challenged each other with throwing contests, blanket tossing, and killing rattlesnakes along the trail. The next year, 1926, Cureton took 8 boys on another double crossing, this time using the new South Kaibab Trail. They would also camp the first night on the sandy Colorado River beach, which they called Little Sahara. At Ribbon Falls, he would get them to clean up by taking a shower bath under the falls. On the cold north rim, they built a huge bonfire, and it was reported one of the pine needle beds caught fire from sparks about midnight, furnishing yet another variety of thrill. After extinguishing the blaze, the crowd wrapped themselves in their blankets and lay as close as possible to the fire until dawn. On the way back, they would fish in Bright Angel Creek, and one night they had to move their camp because they were, quote, driven out by scorpions. In July 1928, Cureton led his fourth such exhibition, this time with both boys and girls. One of the young girls wrote a detailed account of her trip in a letter to a friend in Canada who published it in a Canadian newspaper, which I discovered. It's really interesting. Cureton led the group down the South Kaibab Trail playing his harmonica, and he seemed to play his harmonica all the time as they marched along the trail and taught them many songs. The Black Bridge was almost complete, and the swinging suspension bridge was in place below it. So you can see both the Black Bridge and the older swinging suspension bridge in this picture. So the boys crossed over the old bridge, and I imagine they made it swing and had a great time, and the girls crossed over the steadier Black Bridge. The group camped for the night at the beach, and the young lady wrote, "After supper, we played in the soft silver sands for a while. Then, since we were all tired, we unrolled our blankets and tried to sleep. A hot breeze blew sand in our faces all night. None of us were used to sleeping on the hard ground, so I'm afraid none of us got much sleep that night." Their stroll through Phantom Ranch was amazing. Another quote, "There was a lovely orchard here, and we all gazed hungrily at the peaches and apples hanging on the trees. Carl," which is Cureton's son, "and Leslie dropped behind, and from the smiles on their faces when they again joined us, we knew the peaches were good." They continued and camped near Roaring Springs, where there was a stove and the remains of a construction camp, and took a rest day. At the North Rim, they resupplied their food at the nearly completed original Grand Canyon Lodge. Because Cureton knew the manager, they were allowed to look around the hotel and, quote, almost bought the soda fountain out. After fully supplied, they headed back down the trail and camped again at Roaring Springs, and the boys went fishing. At about noon the next day, they had company at their camp. And here's a fun quote. "A guide came down to our camp with 2 women from Boston, and neither of them had ever been on a mule before, so you can imagine how sore and stiff they were. They had on dresses and little silk hats. Their faces were burnt fiery red, and they were exhausted and uncomfortable. The guide helped them from their mules to the cool shade under the trees there at Roaring Springs. That evening, the group ate fish, played games until they were tired, and told ghost stories before they went to sleep. The next day, they had a water fight in Bright Angel Creek. At Phantom Ranch, they had a birthday party for one of the girls and then camped at the Colorado River. The boys built a large fire on the sand, and they again told stories late into the night. In the morning, they climbed up to tip off and then took the Tonto Trail towards Havasupai Gardens. That's the way it was before the river trail was made in the 30s. The young woman wrote, "We camped at Burrow Springs where Prof told us we could cook anything we wanted, cooked millions of hotcakes, nearly everything we had, then we ate. We marched on to Indian Garden in the afternoon, and there was lots of fruit on the trees, and here we ate plenty of green and ripe ones too, peaches and apples." The next day, they finished their journey at the South Rim. Over the years, Cureton brought nearly 50 people rim to rim and back. In 1955, he suffered a serious stroke, and he died in 1957. He made sure that much of the land he owned in Williams was donated to the city, designated for recreation. In 1960, the city's swimming pool was built on his former land and expanded in 1986 to form Cureton Park. He certainly made a difference. Charlie Thornton from Tucson, Arizona, should be recognized as the founder of the idea to hike rim to rim in one day. In 1947, he began working at the Arizona State School for the Deaf and the Blind. When Thornton first came to the school, there was no physical education program available for the blind students, so he organized it. A student remembered, quote, "So many blind students would just sit on the mat or on the sidelines. He would always try to get them motivated because they were afraid and hadn't been encouraged to do physical activity. Thornton built a running track for the blind boys. NBC aired a news segment on the unique track. It was reported the track is much like any other, with the exception that an inside perimeter is bordered by a curving length of tubular steel handrail. In 1953, Thornton created a hiking club at the school. He came up with the idea for some of them to hike rim to rim across the Grand Canyon. In late May 1956, Thornton led 2 completely blind boys and 4 other partially blind boys down South Kaibab Trail, destined for the North Rim. It took them only 2.5 hours to reach the Colorado River, where they crossed the Black Ridge. They bathed their feet and patched their blisters on the banks of the Colorado River. And going up North Kaibab Trail, they only had to ford the Bright Angel Creek 6 times. The trail was being constructed a lot better. By noon, they reached Ribbon Falls, showered under the spray of the falls, and ate lunch. Thornton said that the boys had an excellent sense of balance and timing and seldom stumbled. He said, going down the trail, the completely blind would keep in touch, usually hand on the shoulder with a man ahead. They follow well. They are used to hiking in single file. Rough terrain holds no terrors for them. But climbing up was more difficult, and they used a rope. Here, the leader fastened a rope along the waist, extended back on either side, and the boys line up between the ropes. Then they grasp the ropes with each hand. The last 5-mile stretch was, of course, grueling. They arrived at the top of the North Rim at 7 p.m. for an impressive 12-hour crossing. It was reported as Raymond Mungaray, age 19, panted to the top. He paused, took a deep breath that burst into a happy grin, clapped his companion on the shoulder, and exclaimed, "Boy, what an experience. We've got a lot to tell the fellows when we get back." In 1958, Thornton led a second group of 8 boys from the school across the canyon, finishing in 11 hours. In 1959, Thornton was fired from the school for the deaf and blind after 10 years of employment because of a difference of opinion over administrative matters. The public was outraged and sent many letters of protest to the Tucson newspapers. Thornton said that the programs he developed for the blind had surpassed those programs for the deaf, and that had caused a rift. The school soon dismantled all that Thornton had built, including the gym and the track. The new Southern Arizona Hiking Club from Tucson, Arizona, took over the organization of the hike in 1960, and 22 hikers took part, including 7 blind boys. After returning home, a participant was questioned, why in the world would anyone take blind kids to see the Grand Canyon? He wrote, "I submit that those blind boys saw more than do half the hurried tourists who promenaded along the rimside patio of Bright Angel Lodge. For I know that those boys smelled the fresh fragrance of the pine trees in the chilly morning breeze, tasted the hot dust going down the downhill trail, and shivered through the waste crossings of the icy Bright Angel Creek. In crossing the mile-deep chasm on foot, they achieved something few sighted visitors will ever equal." In 1992, a reunion of the first group of blind rim-to-rim hikers was held in Tucson. A reporter said, "Ghosts of bubbly teenage boys hiking across the Grand Canyon danced across the memories of the 30 people who gathered." Thornton, age 80, who had recently gone through heart surgery, was honored. He was sad that there was no longer traces of his work at the School of the Blind, but he knew the students, now adults, were living monuments of his work. About a year and a half later, in June 1993, Thornton went missing after he failed to return from a morning hike in the Santa Catalina Mountains above Tucson, Arizona. His car was found in the foothills. His body was found at the bottom of a 40-foot dry waterfall. A nice tribute was written about him in the Tucson newspaper. He did more for those kids than anyone had ever done before. Charlie Thornton was truly the father of Grand Canyon rim-to-rim hikes in a day, and I really think he made a difference. So guides, both employed by the park and others who brought youth to the park, have passed on the love for the canyon to the rising generations and have made a difference. Thank you very much.